So today's Bible study starts with the lessons appointed for the year or the Sunday that's designated in the lectionary as Proper 16, and we are in year B as we have been all year since Advent, and we are on track 2. But the real focus of what we're going to do today is the gospel, which has been for the last few weeks, as we know, taken from the 6th chapter of John. And this is, God be good to us, the concluding portion of that. So we're finally through this long disquisition, as it were, from the Apostle John on this feeding miracle, the feeding of the multitude. And in John's case, it's the feeding of the 5,000. Now, that is itself, I just want to make this comment, a tremendous miracle just to feed 5,000 people. As you know, I was on vacation last week and we were on a cruise ship. And the cruise ship was one of the larger in the lines, and the average number of guests is 6,000. So
Oh,
6,000 people feeding them 3 meals a day plus is just, to me, would be a logistical nightmare. It would be just, how they do this on a regular basis, day after day after day, week after week, through the season, throughout the year, is just, to me, an amazing feat. So to talk about Jesus feeding 5,000 people, the physical dimensions of that story themselves, is be mind-boggling. I mean, just mind-boggling. But as we've been talking about, the real focus of these passages is not so much on the logistics or the physical feeding of people, but the parsing out, the teasing out of that marvelous story into what is essentially the Apostle John's understanding of the Eucharist from our perspective, particularly as a sacramental church. But even over and above that, this notion where Jesus comes to that saying, which we heard already, I am the bread of life. And so that has various levels of meaning. We can go back into ancient texts, not biblical texts necessarily, but other texts as well, where bread or wheat, doesn't need to be wheat bread, it could, in this case, was barley loaves. But grain itself is the term that has been used in poetry and so on, is the staff of life. Where, in other words, once human society evolved into agricultural societies, it was the planting of seed and the harvesting of grain and the processing of that became the way in which individuals and communities were sustained. So for Jesus to use this image in this ancient world is much more powerful, perhaps, than it would be to our ears, because we think of bread as a commodity that we go to the grocery store, the market, the bakery, just to pick up. We are not the agricultural people of the ancient world, where very few of us have ever sauntered through a grain field, for example, and picked heads of grain. You remember the story in Matthew where Jesus got in trouble because his disciples were picking grain and it was on the Sabbath and that was considered work and they were violating the Sabbath rule and all that sort of thing. So that, that experience, that visceral experience of seed planting, watching it grow, harvesting, gathering, threshing, separating, the grain from the chaff, destroying the chaff, taking the grain and then processing it into flour and then making the bread, all of that process would have been a daily occurrence in the ancient world. So that, there were no preservatives, there was no refrigeration, obviously. there were no chemical preservatives and so on, that people made bread constantly. So you had to be processing all of this constantly. So this is a very visceral image that Jesus is using. This idea of feeding with bread, which would have been the experience of every human person in that culture and in that time. And then to take that and then take that image and to give it this theological import where he says, I am the bread of life. So that he's saying that he is now taking on the role of being the sustainer of all life. This is something, again, with that image of the staff of life, this idea of grain, and the whole process of producing it, processing it into flour, making the bread, and so on. That when he says, I am the bread of life, he is really focusing on this idea that the bread of life itself is not a new image. As I just said, that was a very ancient image in the ancient world, the staff of life. And then just now this saying, though, that he, as this prophet, this Galilean prophet, is claiming to be that, that anyone who would listen to his words and follow his teaching would find sustenance, would find the capacity to sustain themselves. And the real critical thing going on in people's minds is making the shift from the physical world where Jesus has just fed, a lot of people with a little bit, into this more spiritual realm that Jesus is addressing. That Jesus is no longer talking about simply physical sustenance, how we get from day to day, but rather has elevated the conversation to a new level of meaning, so that we're talking about now not so much making sure our bodies are fed, although that's the fundamental level, but rather that we are now talking about how does one sustain the spiritual life? How does one find sustenance, food and drink and so on in the spiritual realm? And remember, this is John. And remember again, from the very beginning of John's gospel, we have this tension with the Gnostics about the earthly, fleshly existence and this spiritual existence. And that in John is constantly saying that the two things are inseparable, because the Gnostics are saying that they are separable, and in fact, the spiritual life is superior to anything in the created order. And that's not Jewish to begin with. I mean, it's not real Judaism from the get-go. And as an inheritor of that tradition, Christians John is in tension with the philosophers of the Greek world, who saw the higher life, the life of the mind and the life of gnosis, knowledge, and so on, as a superior way of existence. And so we have this juxtaposition of these two things in chapter 6, where we begin with the more visceral, fleshly feeding of the 5,000, and we end up in this discussion about that spiritual life. And that the two things in this context are forever put together. That it is in the incarnation, in the fleshly person of Jesus of Nazareth, who is the incarnate Word, that these two things can never be separated. So too then, the resurrection stories become critical, because our common experience and our common idea about death is that it is at the point of death that our spirit is separated from our flesh. But in the resurrection of Jesus, the teaching becomes, for Christians, that these two things coexist and are forever intertwined. even though we may experience the dissolution of the flesh, namely the decay of the body, that it is in this future resurrection that we are quote unquote reunited. And that's what causes so many people so much problem because we can't conceive of that. It's beyond our experience. And so consequently, for example, that was for centuries in Christendom, the prohibition against anything like cremation, because by deciding to be cremated, one was making a protest against this concept, because you were deliberately destroying the fleshly part of our existence. And it was often used to prove that there was no unification between the body and the spirit when it was deliberately chosen. That's one of the reasons, for example, that heretics were burned, was because they had committed the unforgivable sin, and so consequently would be punished in this worldly sense of punishment by forever having their ashes separated from their spirit in such manner that in the medieval and late medieval and early modern mind, that they could never be reunited. And so the traditional burial of the body and all that sort of thing, and you get into really traditional burials, you'll notice that the orientation of the cemetery is such that the head of the deceased is to the west, and that the body is laid on its back, so that at the resurrection, when the graves are opened, you would come out of your grave and you would see the sun in the morning. And that was all kinds of ritual symbolism built into our churches, built into our graveyards, built into all of that, because of this notion of the forever unification of the body and the spirit. Now, in modern times, we understand that that doesn't happen. And in fact, in medieval practice, I always found it anomalous that in monasteries, for example, because space was limited and these monasteries lasted for hundreds of years, once your body was decayed, they would dig you up and they would put your bones in a room in the deep basements of the monastery called an ossarium, from the Latin for bones, because it was a bone room. And basically, your bones were then translated from the grave in which you lay for a period of time while your body decayed, and then transferred into this ossarium so that there would be more room to bury more monks and nuns and so on, because there was just so much space. So even that was, a little puzzling to the mind, but at the same time, that is all sort of tied into this idea of physicality and spirit. And the two things are never really fully separated for a person of Christian faith. Because Jesus, being, as Paul calls Jesus, the firstborn of the dead, is the sign and symbol of what our destiny is. But the cool thing about the resurrection that I often preach on Easter is that this is no mere resuscitation. It is a transfiguration, is a transposition, if you will, transformation of our earthly existence into this other dimensional existence that still is part of creation, still a part of God's creation, which to me is essential. If, in our modern understanding of the universe and so on, we know that the earth will not be here forever, and that one of these days the sun will become a supernova and consume all the planets around it and all that sort of thing. But we're just one star in billions and billions of stars in the universe. And, that will, you have to have a theological shift those more ancient understandings of, the way we're buried and all that kind of stuff don't make any sense in our modern cosmology when we understand, the Carl Sagan view of the universe. It's just, we're one puny part of the universe. So consequently, this becomes very important with all of that from a deep dive point of view. So all of that is to say that that's what's been happening all the 6th chapter, is Jesus has been unfolding this idea of the bread of life. So we get to the point now where we're toward the end, and he's saying things like, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, you cannot have life within you. And unless you drink my blood, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he's talking to Jewish people. And Jewish people would have just a bit of a tad of a problem with this idea of eating human flesh to begin with. But the question of blood, because blood was anathema to the Jew. Touching blood made you impure, made you unclean. And hence the need for the mikvah, the ritual baths and so on. And why, the whole idea of kosher, the way things were slaughtered and meat was slaughtered and so on, all had to be done in a certain way because of the idea that life was in the blood. That you cannot have life without blood. And so the idea was, if you were going to drink blood, you were drinking a life force. And so when, for example, in pagan rituals, the drinking of blood, usually animal blood, not human blood, became part of the ritual, that was, really, really off limits, because the idea was you were drinking the life of the God into you. And so it's keenly ironic that in the gospel stories, Jesus talks about drinking his blood. And all of a sudden, then we begin to see this notion of life, that Jesus is saying, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, or you will not have life within you. That this God-man, this incarnate word, now is offering himself as the means by which we are divinized. We become as God.
Wouldn't that be outrageous to the Jews?
Absolutely.
So it wasn't a very good recruiting tool.
Well, but that's what today's passage tells us. And all of that was so that we can read now this particular passage and see why the end of the 6th chapter of John in this way is so difficult. So let's do that now. Let's go to the board, as it were. Let's do the share. And we'll read this final passage of this chapter, which is the final installment in these several Sundays in liturgical reading. Jesus said, "Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate and they died, but the one who eats this bread will live forever." He said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. Now, when many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" But Jesus, being aware that his disciples were complaining about it, said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But among you there are some who do not believe. For Jesus knew from the first who were the ones who did not believe, and who was the one that would betray him. And he said, for this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father. Because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. So Jesus asked 12, do you also wish to go away? But Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of everlasting life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. Here ends the lesson.
Well, um, the, the the disciples that were not strong enough to hang on to that message, and his own, are really shaken by this. It's pulling out from them their underpinnings of their understanding of Jewish law.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing that he was able to convince as many people as he did. It's a really tough sell, and it's a tough one for us to understand this. It's easy to say it like it's a campaign slogan, but to really believe it becomes a really troublesome task.
Mm. Mm. Well, yeah, I mean, thank you, George, for that, because I think that's one of this particular passage has so much for us in it, quite apart from that theological piece that we just did. Just the thing that you just described, that sometimes the teachings of Jesus can seem almost insurmountably difficult.
Yeah.
And that there will be those who identified as followers of Jesus, as disciples, and then they hear something that is just beyond them. They just can't accept it. And they turn back and they no longer go about with Jesus. And no one ever says anywhere that I'm aware of in scripture that once someone turned back like this, that they never returned. I love to go back to that story of the rich young man where he comes to Jesus and he asks him, what must I do to gain eternal life? And Jesus gives him the standard answer, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, and and keep the law, blah, 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 all that. He says, I have done all of this since my youth. And then he turns to the man and says, well, there's one more thing you must do. You must sell all you have and give to the poor. And the gospel writer tells us the man turned away because he was very rich. He turned away very sad. And what I love to talk about when that scripture comes up is that nowhere does it ever say that he never thought about it a second time. That no one ever says he turned away permanently.
Yeah.
In the moment, it was too much for him. But we can just use our curiosity and our imagination and then ask ourselves the question, is it possible that this rich young man came back to Jesus after he had considered all of this, sold all he had, and came to follow Jesus? We don't know that. That's never told us. And when we just sort of talk about the scriptures and we just, all right, that story's over, all the characters are gone, we don't need to think about them anymore. These are, if they're real stories, they're real people, and people have these second thoughts. Maybe something else has changed their mind. Case in point, this speaker is coming to St. Luke's 2 weeks hence, and has changed his mind on Christian ethics, particularly around some very strongly held convictions of the evangelical tradition, and in part because of his life experience. In point of fact, one of the things is his stand on LGBTQ issues relative to evangelical positions. And the book that he wrote about that, his journey on that, was Changing Our Mind. And that it takes time sometimes and experience for us to say that maybe this awfully hard teaching that I can't accept right now, in time, our heart will be softened, our mind will be changed, whatever, wherever the locus of that decision-making process is, that we might come to understand what Jesus is trying to accomplish and what Jesus is trying to do. So what you said just before we read that yes, this is a hard teaching. And in fact, just the imagery itself would be repugnant to many people, to the point where it's just, I just cannot conceive of this idea that you're talking about. And they turn away. And John puts it that way. He said, this teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?
Well, isn't that the way with most things that are totally new and totally difficult to us? I mean, like I remember when I first started taking calculus, and I was kind of like, what is this?
Right.
But it takes to repeated exposure and repeated hearing and repeated practice. It's like you learn anything. You don't expect a 6-year-old to have the same knowledge of what's in the Eucharist as you would an adult.
Well,
it's a growth process, and some people grow and want to grow, and other people don't necessarily do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there is a chance to grow, and it takes repetition and thought. Because I mean, my interpretation of John is totally different from what it would have been 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. 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 Well, and so when we start talking about these various things in our religious life, some of the social media around this appearance of the speaker in a couple of weeks is, the way that Jen sort of marketed it was, how would Jesus vote? And everybody said, well, Jesus would never vote. Blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. Well, no, of course not. He didn't live in a democracy, but we are disciples of Jesus. Jesus teaches us value orientations in our life. We are living in a democracy. It is the way in which we organize our society. So how do we make one fit into the other is the question. And often when we don't do that, that's when we get into trouble, because then we, Jesus' teaching are nice and pure and clean and everything. We leave them up there. And then, of course, we have our society over here. And that's Gnosticism all over again, is it not? Where, our fleshly existence, our existence in society with one another and so on, that's over here. And that's not to be tainted by this faith stuff. It's, we can fall into those traps so easily. And we just need to kind of constantly remind ourselves that if we are disciples, that forever we are changed, that the values of Jesus transform and change the way we live in this fleshly existence of ours, which includes the society in which we find ourselves.
I can see those two concrete silos right now.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's sort of that question that, has been thrown out. Why are you even saying that? Gee, and it makes me uncomfortable. You're trying to inject religion into politics. Well, no, here's the difference. And this is something that I think is a misunderstanding in our culture, in our society, that when we talk about the separation of church and state, it isn't that the two don't influence each other, but that the two are not the same. That's what we try to do here. So that, and it's my firm belief as, sort of an amateur historian and so on, that the founding people of our nation and of our system of government and so on encourage this notion of the separation of the two and the whole idea of religious freedom and non-establishment of religion and all of that. Because if you read, and a careful reading as far as I'm concerned, because they saw the church or religion or religious thought to be the conscience of society, not the other way around. So that the power of government should never be brought to bear to crush the conscience, but that the conscience in Enlightenment thought is the core of human, they wouldn't say righteousness because that's not an Enlightenment concept, but the idea of righteousness comes from the exercise of one's conscience or the conscientious exercise of one's values. And so the government must never use its power to create what those are or are not in the individual or in the corporate entity, which is we call church or synagogue or mosque or whatever. So religious pluralism and religious freedom were values that were there so that these communities could become the very conscience of the broader society. So the idea that we would speculate and think about and theologize about the values that Jesus taught and then bring them to bear to our modern context is what we were supposed to be doing from the get-go. And that goes back to this Gnostic idea. We can't separate the two totally. If we do, it's heretical. And it allows then, people to act one way here and another way here. Rather, we are called as followers of Jesus to bring those two worlds together, not in a power structure, but to allow the values of the kingdom of God to influence the way we make decisions, the way we live our lives. And in living our lives, we are to strive, as our baptismal promise says, for justice and peace, and to uphold the dignity of every human being, because we see those values as the core values of the kingdom of God. So that's just a little sort of tangential discussion about politics for the moment. But going back to the core of all of this, we also can find that sometimes those teachings can be very, very difficult for us. And there are people who will leave a community of faith because they just cannot see their way through. And so the question becomes for us, are we more concerned about the institution and the viability about the institution and how many people, to be crass for a moment, how many fannies are in the pew? And tailor our message to make that happen? Or are we about preaching the values of the kingdom of God, preaching the values that Jesus taught? And for lack of a better term, let the chips fall where they may. People who will, like Peter, say, where will we go? You have the words of everlasting life. Peter's basically saying, this is hard for me too, but I guess I'll get on with it. One of the things in terms of the context of this particular passage, again, too, is for us to remember that the Passover meal has not yet happened. Because you see, in John, Jesus is the Passover lamb. So as the lamb for Passover is slaughtered and eaten by the believers, by the Jewish family, so too now the Passover, the ultimate Passover lamb, who is Jesus, will be sacrificed on the cross. And in that sacrifice then gives his flesh and blood as food, as does the Passover lamb. And what is the Passover lamb? It is the remembrance of God's largesse and God's grace to the chosen of God, namely the people of God, so that they are preserved and delivered. So the whole Exodus story comes to mind, the whole deliverance story. So, this isn't as neat and tidy as it seems. There's a lot of, I would say, background material that would be bubbling around in the back of these Jewish people's heads that is not in ours, because it's not our experience. We have no experience of celebrating Passover as such, in terms of the way we sometimes have celebrated it here, when we sort of did a kind of play acting of a Passover, when we said, the opening line on Holy Thursday, on Monday, Thursdays, why is this night different than any other night? And then we go into the Exodus story and so on. That's all, rooted in this idea from John, that Jesus is that Passover lamb who is sacrificed to deliver humanity as a whole, not just the Jewish race, but now it's being extended to the entirety of humanity.
Well, I think it would be interesting to ferret this concept, which is so difficult, out of the other gospel stories as to how they handled it or did not handle it.
Mhm.
And in Mark, do we hear anything of this nature?
No, we don't even get a
And
resurrection story in Mark. We just get an empty tomb.
yeah, and but yet he must have been aware of things that had been said or told to be said by Jesus. So he wasn't up to it, I guess. And so then, do we see any progress in Matthew and Luke on this particular thing? Or is this John taking us to a whole new level?
Perfect question. I'm either a very good teacher or you're extremely wise and insightful, and I think it's the latter, actually. But you're exactly on point here, because again, remembering again, just to be, get our technical hats on for a moment. John's the last of the canonical gospels. It's the latest written. So it's the most developed from a theological point of view. And George, as you have said many times, he's writing to these Greek people who have this philosophical bent. That Mark, being the earliest, notice, has the very least of all of this kind of stuff in it, and John, being the latter or the latest of the four, has so much of it in. So the question becomes: did Jesus even say these words?
Yeah.
Or is this a way of the narrative of John's narrative teaching us what the core values of the Jesus message and the Jesus movement are? So that, for example, when we get to that portion of today's lesson that says, for this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father. What does that mean? It's almost like Jesus is restricting things, but that's not the universalism of the message. But rather, the idea is that the Father wills that all would be saved. I mean, we go back to the beginning of the gospel, and we see that it is the Father's will that all should be saved. But there will be those who will be of such hard-heartedness that they will not be able to accept this teaching. So the question becomes about us. Have we softened our hearts for the working? Notice this is we're talking about the Spirit again. We go back to John 3, where Jesus is talking to Nicodemus. The Spirit blows where it will. We don't know where it's coming or where it's going, all that sort of thing, all that sort of imagery. And so the idea that God is constantly moving and doing these things, and that there will be new things revealed that may be beyond what Jesus may have said or not. But when we become very literalist about it, then we find ourselves kind of painted into a corner. So that what we need to look at is Peter's response. Again, I love Peter because he's such a, self-contradictory figure in all of the gospel passages.
Just so human. He's earthy.
Precisely, Kathy. Because, he's like, I just can't deal with this, but I don't know what else to do. So I'll just keep following you. And that's all Jesus is asking of us. Just keep on keeping on. It'll all come. You may not have the whole picture ever, but just remain with me. Abide in me, and I. There's another one of those sayings. I am the vine, you are the. All of that stuff starts flooding in all of a sudden when we begin to see that this is about relationship to Jesus, as Paul says, the firstborn of the dead. And then how we remain attached to that is the avenue, that is the means by which we find ourselves sliding into everlasting life. We don't knock on a door and open it and there it is. It's not a bag of goods to be purchased or possessed. But actually, just like we kind of go through life, none of us is in the body we were in 10 years ago. George, you're a physician. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Every cell in our body has died and regenerated.
Oh, yes.
Every bit of it. And that the body that I possess in this moment is not the body that I possessed 10 years ago. And I don't mean that I'm in less fit condition and all that kind of stuff. It's just physically, the cells are not the same as they were. And we have this false sense of permanence about fleshly existence, which is why, for example, we have a hard time dealing with the fact that after our body decays, the resurrection of the dead, of which we profess, can't happen. The skeptics and so on. But we've been experiencing this in some form, some metaphorical form, from the time we were born. There's almost nothing in our body that is the same from the moment of our birth. It's all continuous, however.
Yeah. And as the disciples were struggling with this, I wonder where the conversion of Paul comes in, because he said he studied for 19 years before he went out to speak,
mm-hmm.
and that he became the great explainer of the meaning of Jesus's teachings. And if it hadn't been for him, I don't think the church would have survived.
Yeah.
And so that his message was one that people could understand and accept. So powerful were they that they could do that by just reading the words on paper,
mm-hmm.
because he couldn't be everywhere at once. And so he was a tremendous force. But I don't recall in any of our readings of his teachings getting into this kind of discussion. It was more like things that they could relate to in their own bodies, in their own minds, their own experiences. So we put these things together, and I'm going to sound like an idiot now, but we really have three forces. What Jesus actually said and did, how Paul tried to interpret it so they could understand as much of it as possible. And then John comes and he really goes so deeply into it that it is very hard to understand, but turns out to be the most fundamental of them all.
It's a wonderful way. It's not an idiot way.
It's beautiful, George.
It's absolutely marvelous.
I don't know. It just, I probably won't remember 5 minutes from now what I said.
We have it recorded so we can come back to it. But even as you're saying that, it comes to mind as well that frequently it has been said, for example, that Jesus never established the church. You know, we say the church is one foundation, is Jesus Christ our Lord, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But even that's a Pauline image that, in fact, the church, as we understand it, the ecclesia, this grouping of people that comes together in worship and mutual support and all of that, is a Pauline construct and not a construct of Jesus. That what comes together eventually as the church is what happens as the church, as this group emerges from the synagogue community. Because again, remember, even Paul's earliest mission used the network of Jewish synagogues, because he was a Jew's Jew, as he likes to say himself in different words, and so he was teaching about this Jewish Messiah. So this Messiah figure, this Jesus, in the early work, is going to be this Jewish Messiah, but it gets wedded with the universalism of St. Paul, where we take this out of simply the Jewish community, and then we begin to understand that this is a universalist message. It's for all people, not just for people of Hebrew origin, but rather that it is Jew and Gentile, slave and, go back to Galatians, that every person, every human being is a child of God. Every human being needs to come to this deep understanding and so on of what Jesus taught. So the way I kind of like to articulate it a bit is that Jesus established a movement. Paul is the one who put together what we call the church, which even in Paul's day was not this heavily institutionalized kind of reality that we experience, or that even people have experienced for the last 8, 9, 10, 11 centuries. That is a much later reality. But rather, it's about this basic community of people who are of similar value orientation. But that's a fundamental ecclesiology, if you will, or a theology of the church, that we come to faith by following the teachings of Jesus, like Peter. Who are we going to go to? You have the words of everlasting life. So we follow these teachings, and because we end up being of like mind, we seek mutual support. We're social animals by our creation. We're hardwired for that. So we create these societies, and these societies are what end up being the church. And they are nascent in Paul's experience, because Paul, with his missions, journeys and so on, established these little communities. We think, well, Paul is writing to the church in Rome. Well, we think it's like a basilica full of people or something. No, it was maybe 20, 25, maybe 30, 35 people. It was this tiny little community. And it grew, like Topsy, in the first century and afterwards, and of course became problematic, and hence the whatever new thing is introduced is always seen as the scapegoat for whatever is wrong with a declining society. And so when Rome was having difficulty, what did they do? They blamed this new group, these Christians, because they refused to do things like worship the emperor, and all this kind of stuff. And so they became othered. And when they othered them, then we could persecute them, because whenever something is other and separate from us, we claim the right to be able to destroy it because it's infecting us. It's like a virus. And so the dominant forces of society will want to eliminate it. And so, and that's true across human history. So whenever we see a structured persecution or, bigotry or something all put together, it's because some group, some dominant group has decided to other a particular group, and they have identified certain characteristics that others can see. And in doing so, then we justify marginalizing them, the least onerous kind of thing, or destroying them, the most onerous kind of thing. And so when you hear this language, that's what's happening. That's what's happened. That's what happened in 1930s Europe, where the Jew became the scapegoat. In our day, for a while, and still today, it's probably in our culture and in our society, because of 9/11 and so on, it's Muslims and Islam. Or, the original sin of American culture relative to race and slavery and racism and Jim Crow and segregation and all of that sort of thing. All of that to keep someone that we could easily identify with certain characteristics separate from us, who also have similar characteristics, namely white skin, Eastern, Western European origins, et cetera, so whatever it is, and so that we could analyze this all the way back to the early church, where the Jews and why the language in John is so seemingly anti-Semitic, the Jews, because this Christian movement has just been expelled from the synagogues. They were othered. And so in order to unite this nascent community, they did the reverse othering. And because John is written after the destruction of the temple and the expulsion, and the diaspora experience of the late first century CE, when all of a sudden, Jews are dispersed from Palestine and so on, because the Romans have had enough of their, nationalism and all that sort of thing, that the temple is destroyed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so now the synagogue network sees this messianic community, this Jesus messianic community, as being, they're the problem. That's why this all happened. And so they expel them from the synagogues. And now they're homeless in a sense. And so they bind together and they find solace in one another. And so you get into that. And then the Roman persecution begins. And as the Roman persecution begins, then you have the book of Revelation, which is, stick to it, no matter how bad it gets, God will make it come out in the end. That's the message of the book of Revelation. So that all of this is working together. So we, kind of try to bring it back. This idea that Jesus is the source and summit of all of this. So basically, as Christians, as followers, we always need to go back to Jesus. And what we can ferret out of the scriptures, the holy words, the written words of what Jesus taught and what values are inherent in that meaning, and then say, okay, how do I live my life accordingly? How do I remain a part of this movement that Jesus started and that his followers then, in a sense, enfleshed, institutionalized, and we call that the church? Kathy, you're really, I can see those wheels turning.
The wheels are turning in their I don't know if they're turning in a good way or not right now, but they are turning. And it's hard to put into words, but
Well, no need to. I mean, we can wait,
yeah, okay. I could write a paper on this.
Yeah, of course.
But what else is new? It's what I'm thinking of is how we handle our reaction to this and how we bring up people in Christian education. To understand what was really, because I mean most people think John is just this abstract thing, but it's probably, to me, it's very earthy.
It's quite the contrary, right?
Yeah, it's the most earthy. It's Mark tells the story quick and dirty. Matthew and Luke tell us who Jesus was, what his ministry was on earth. And John brings it all home into what his ministry is for us as we go along in life.
We could, that's well put. And maybe just transforming a little bit the idea of John, as John is trying to tell us what it all means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What does this mean? Because meaning is something we can apprehend for ourselves, and then it becomes real. It becomes life. There's the terminology. It becomes life-giving.
Yeah.
Because we can live out of that meaning. If we're just talking about this humanoid, or whatever you want to call Jesus, the Theos and Air, whatever, that lived 2,000 years ago in this far off land from where we are in the present moment, you and I, then that's more abstract, because it's a story about a person who lived a long time ago. It could be Aeneid or Virgil or Homer, or one of these people who are just telling stories about these heroes of the past.
But I think what I've been trying to do lately with myself is put myself in the position of being one of those people who heard the message.
Yes.
And how would I have gotten it?
Yeah. And that's what John is so good at, because I am the bread of life. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you. It's like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and it's not simply a dogmatic statement about sacramentality in the Eucharist, although that is one of the reflections of it. But what does that mean then? Because it's not just simply getting the chip and the drink. It's about the fact that this only happens when we gather.
And it also is our life.
See, when someone comes to church on a Sunday, to Eucharist, and only comes to receive communion, they miss the point. Because the point is, all who have come here to receive this bit of bread and this bit of wine are coming together, and it is in the coming together that we are changed and transformed. That's why the bread is broken, blessed, broken, and distributed. The way I try to teach it to young people when I, was back in the day when I had that responsibility, was I would actually bring a ball of yarn that had lots of different stray ends on it. And I would ask each of the kids in the class to grab hold of one of the ends of that. And then I would say, hold on, keep holding on. You can't let go. You can't let go. And then I would move this central thing around and they would have to move with it. And when you think of that central thing, that ball of yarn, whatever it is, rope, whatever, is Jesus. And that by joining ourselves, by holding on to those threads, if there were, and as long as we remain connected to this central thing, that's the church. That's the purpose of the church. So that when Jesus is using this imagery, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, means you must, and the word is even there, abide in me and I in them. That's holding on to that thread. And what is the practical way that's done? Well, that's the teachings. Those are the teachings, the value orientation, so that we all become of like mind. We all become, as Paul says in Philippians, your attitude must be that of Christ. In other words, we take it and we integrate it into our brains and into our life patterns, our rule of life, our way of life. And we become, in that sense, we become all the same. Oh, we all remain different because each one of those threads is different. But we move with Christ. It's a metaphor and it fails, but kids get it then. It's like, teams, sports teams are the same way. That's unfortunate that so many of our sports teams today are not about the team, they're about the stars on the team. And the guy or gal who gets, sort of the the workman's pay, as it were, not the star power pay, doesn't get much notice in, in the annals of Sports Illustrated and all that kind of stuff. Only the star power gets it. So that, back in the day when I was young and O.J. Simpson was the premier running back of the Buffalo Bills, you heard a lot about O.J. Simpson and maybe the quarterback that was, extant at the time. You didn't hear about the linemen who were the blockers, who got people out of the way so that Simpson could make his gains. They were not the heroes. That's why I think hero in sports parlance is a wrong use of that term, because it elevates individuals over the whole of the team. Those people cannot accomplish great things without the effective working together. It's the same thing in the church. We cannot do the work of Jesus without holding together. And so this teaching on the Eucharist that we've been exploring for 6 weeks now is critical to the life of the church. Because as we said, John is telling us what it means. It isn't about the simple remembering of this person, Jesus, or what Jesus said or did, but it's taking it and making it real in us.
And keeping it real in us.
Yes.
Letting it transform us, even though we generally fight it every step of the way.
Absolutely. And so even Peter, smart mouth Peter, recalcitrant Peter, Peter who speaks his mind when he should be quiet, is the one who says it right. where else will we go? He's basically saying, I can't deal with this either. But for now, I have no alternatives. I'm in. And even after this, we hear the story, even in John's gospel, about Peter's betrayal. But it is also at the end of John's gospel where we have Peter reconciled to Christ. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Of course I love you. That scene on the shore of Tiberias, the Sea of Tiberias. So I love Peter. And I am Peter. I mean, there are days when I just like, oh Lord, I can't deal with this. But all Jesus is asking any of us to do at this point is just keep on keeping on. Keep following. Walk this path, walk this walk. The rest of it will follow. And you will, I hate to say it this way because it sounds too, sliding into eternal life sounds like it's easy. It's not. It's more like being dragged into it in some ways. But just like we find ourselves today in different bodies than we did 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, or 80 years ago for some of us, so too we will find ourselves in a different place when we talk about that wonderful everlasting life. Because we just keep on keeping on. That's all that's needed.
It's like where we are, we're experiencing the climax of everything that's important with this aspect of our readings of all the way up to this particular moment.
Mhm. Mhm.
And how really fundamental it is to us, and the struggle for understanding it is not surprising. And but this particular area that we're reading in turns out to be so fundamental and so important that I feel like all my life I've just skipped over it.
Well, but there's nothing wrong in that, George. In fact, that's probably the way all of us are and should be. I tell my students, for example, often, and Kathy's heard this as well, that I've been at this as of this year. I am in priestly ministry for 43 years, public ministry for 44. I was ordained a deacon in 1980. So that I today continue to learn and grow deeper. I am the first one to say I don't have the whole picture yet. And the ... after that, the ellipsis after that is and never will. And anyone who feels that they have it is in error, because that's not the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus is this constant and continual growth. I mean, there is no, graduation from being a disciple. The only one who is higher than the disciple is the teacher. And if we say Jesus is the teacher, great teacher, then we are constantly striving to become more and more the teacher. Now, there are those of us who teach other disciples. but that's the circle of life. I mean, parents teach their children, children in turn grow up, become adults, become parents, teach their children. That's a given. But that doesn't mean that anyone who is a teacher within the Christian discipline has the whole story. None of us does. I mean, we can sound like it sometimes when we have these apodictic statements and so on. But none of us, if we're truly true to it, really does have that. And so we always will end up like Peter saying, this is just too much. And maybe need to take a step back sometimes, maybe need to take a rest, maybe need to allow things to percolate a bit. It's a constant challenge. And so that's why, our discipline, our spiritual discipline of Eucharistic attendance on a weekly basis, as much as possible, and so on, is critical for the development of the Christian community, because that's how we grow. And that's always been the danger of things like confirmation programs and so on, because so many people think, oh, I got confirmed, I don't have to do this anymore. It's like, I got it all. No, you don't. You're just starting. Your confirmation, and your teen years is your kindergarten graduation in the school of discipleship. You're just starting out here. So, it's that reality, and that we're constantly learning. I mean, and anybody who's honest with themselves realizes this. So that that's the other thing about what this passage is. I just want to make a couple of points here, which seem small compared to the bigger ones we were making. And that is that belief in Jesus constantly will cause challenge and division, because there will always be something that people just can't fathom. And unless they have that openness, as Peter seems to, then they'll say, this is too much for us, and they'll walk away. And so, we have to always, one of the challenges for us then is this. We are hardwired, and this is a gift of God, this is a grace of God, for curiosity. To be curious. Always to ask the next time, well, what does that mean? Or what does that mean for me? Or maybe I think I got this now. And then all of a sudden, that begins to break down, and something new comes along that says, ooh, that's a little hard for me. Because we like to rest in certainty. And that's the danger in the church, that we can become dogmatic and say, this is the answer. That's what I love about the Anglican way, is it never rests in that dogmatism. But because of our value of human reason, our immense regard for the scriptures, and the need for us for community, which is the physical outcome of tradition, that these three things are the marks of Anglican theology. And these are the things that keep us moving forward. But that moving forward can be very hard for people. And so people will come because somehow they found something that was valued. And once they find it, they want to keep it. And once something else comes along that says, oh, this is too much for me, then they're gone. But the challenge for leadership in the Anglican way is always, okay, we never close the door on anyone. Hence my love of that story of the rich young man. There are those who say that, there's this story of, if you go back to Mark's Passion narrative, there's a man who is vested in nothing but a sheet or a tunic. And he is so frightened that he runs away naked. Well, that's often thought by scholars as a metaphor for new Christians who were just baptized, hence the white garment, but then find the Christian way too much. And so, that's something that we need to be there, that one of the marks that we have to have is that our minds and our hearts always remain open to the new thing that God may be doing among us. There's also the thing about complaining. It's this little bit. You notice that John says they complained. What other context do we see? I mean, Jesus even points it out in this particular passage where people are eating bread and they're complaining.
The Exodus.
In the desert, yeah.
Yeah.
God's giving them manna from above, and they're complaining. We're tired of this. Well, Jesus is saying, yeah, to the disciples are complaining. This is too hard. The Hebrews were complaining. This journey is too long. It's too hot. We seem to be hardwired for that too. But the reality is, if we go back to Exodus, God always has an answer for it. We just need to be open for what that answer might be. And sometimes God's answer isn't so pleasant, like when he sent serpents. Like, I'll teach you. But then he gives them the antidote for that as well. So there's never any final, you ask the wrong question, you're out. It doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. So when we hear this passage on Sunday, it's both a passage of challenge, but also a passage of great hope.
Well, that's good, because I've struggled with this for so long. I thought something was wrong with me. But I realized I'm very pleased to hear that even someone as smart as you struggles with it just with me.
I'm not smart. I just had a lot of training in this particular area.
Well, I think you're pretty smart.
So, well, we're drawing to the end of our time, so we'll call it for the day. But again, this journey through these last few weeks relative to the 6th chapter of John is an immensely important thing for the church and for us individually, as we hear about this notion of sustenance and being fed. That's where the hope comes in, is that whenever we begin to be hungry, where must we turn? We must turn to Jesus. Because we cannot do it on our own. That's the key message here, is that our own devices, our own reason, our own capacities cannot bring us to that place where we find what we need. We find what we need in Christ. Hence, we need to eat his flesh and drink his blood so that he abides in us and we in him. We remain connected. And by remaining connected to Christ, we end up being connected to one another. The great image of that in our modern day is the World Wide Web. The internet is as successful as it is because it has tremendous redundancy built into it. Probably the signals that are being sent in this very meeting that you and I are enjoying have been transferred from one node to another 1,000,000 times. That is the interconnection between us and Christ and what makes the church its community. So with that in mind, we'll stop bouncing from node to node.
As long as you don't make me deal with Comcast for a while.
No, well, I dealt with them yesterday. I had a good time. So,
Oh, that's good. That's good. I had a bad experience with them yesterday.
Too bad.
Trying to get my voicemail.
God bless you.
Yes, they just the FCC or somebody decided they needed a PIN number, and Comcast wouldn't let me. it gave me one, but it told me I had to change it, and then it wouldn't let me change it, and
Yeah, yeah.
I
Well,
was calling it all sorts of interesting names.
well, that's not the internet itself. That's just the
That's just Comcast.
that's a corporate entity. All right,
Yeah.
so we'll see you all in church, I hope, on Sunday. So take care.
Yes. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye. Have a good week.
Bye bye.
Thank you.